It happens in every war. Prisoners are taken. Spies and informants are rounded up. Pilots are shot down and captured. And many of them will be asked to answer questions they'd rather not answer.
Attack Squadron 35.
Interrogation is difficult enough for soldiers to deal with, but for a group of civilian volunteers, spending a weekend being questioned by trained professionals is an eye-opening experience. Along the way, they'll be subjected to the same tricks of the trade that expert questioners have developed over the years. An encyclopedia of techniques for making people reveal things they don't want to.
Camp X-Ray, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Over 3,000 prisoners of the War on Terror are being held here, suspected of belonging to militant Islamic groups like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. Some of them possess valuable information their captors desperately need. But how do they get it? In times past, that wouldn't have been a problem, at least not in theory. For most of human history, the most effective means of getting someone to tell you something he didn't want to tell you was to torture him. But torture had its drawbacks. It took time, it was messy, and the victims often died before they revealed any secrets. And even when someone did confess, it was hard to know if they were telling the truth or just saying anything to stop the pain. When the use of torture on military prisoners was essentially banned by the Geneva Conventions in 1929, interrogators had to find other ways of getting unwilling enemy agents to talk. Interrogators began to focus on breaking down the mind as well as the body. Over time, a host of new and effective interrogation strategies have evolved. Methods just short of torture, and very much out of the public eye. The most successful are currently being used in the War on Terror, on these men in orange jumpsuits. And if you're wondering how a person who doesn't want to talk can be made to talk without actually being tortured, you'll want to pay attention to what happens during the course of a weekend in Aldershot, England. The people in this room will soon be wearing orange jumpsuits of their own. They volunteered to spend a few days being captured and interrogated by a team of highly trained former military specialists. This is the initial orientation meeting held early on Saturday morning.
Right, morning everybody, how are you?
Very well.
You're good? Right, we start. Okay.
Although the volunteers aren't aware of it, the process of breaking down their defenses has already begun. They've been kept up late the night before and have only had a few hours sleep.
Okay, so I'll just go over that. For example, very simple.
The interrogators will have another advantage. Since the volunteers have only just met each other, there's no deep group cohesion to overcome. The prisoners-to-be are given specific instructions on what not to do.
If you should be compromised and arrested by non-friendlies, do not talk about anything to do with this mission. Do not talk about family details. Do not sign or write anything.
Since some of the interrogation team members are active in undercover work, their identities will be shielded.
It's a beautiful sunny day, good company. Should be fun.
The volunteers are broken up into small groups and sent on a hypothetical mission. They must pick up a letter from their first contact, a street tramp on a corner. It says a plan is underway to smuggle a secret agent out of England. Next contact, twins in a coffee shop who pass along another letter. This one contains an airline flight number and time of departure. At a medical center, they learn that the airplane will be leaving from Heathrow, London. And finally, in a parking lot, they get the final piece of information, the name of the secret agent, Danny Ryman. Each of the volunteers knows all the details of the escape plan by midday Saturday around lunchtime. But on this particular Saturday, there will be no lunch. Grabbing people when they least expect it, like the middle of the night, is a good way to disorient them, a technique perfected during the 1930s by Stalin's secret police. At the height of Stalin's purges, millions of ordinary citizens were arrested and accused of crimes against the revolution. Many of them were brought to this building in the heart of Moscow, the Lubyanka, the headquarters of Stalin's feared secret police, the NKVD. Their interrogators had only one goal: to extract a confession.
It was an excuse to get rid of what they saw as political enemies. So therefore, the interrogation was not the pursuit of truth, but the extraction of false confessions that could then be used to justify the purging of those individuals.
The NKVD developed a systematic approach to breaking down a prisoner's resistance. One of the pioneers in the field was Nikolai Yezhov, nicknamed the Dwarf, who was appointed head of the NKVD in 1936. A cruel and ruthless man who used torture routinely, Yezhov also developed sophisticated psychological strategies to make prisoners confess to crimes they hadn't committed. The techniques he developed became known as the Yezhov method.
They were really masters of the kinds of excruciating interrogation techniques that you would use. They're not all thumb screws. Depriving a person of sleep, not letting a person know what's going to happen to them. All were very sophisticated ways to get a person to confess because it was in their interest to do so.
Not many of the thousands of prisoners interrogated at Lubyanka lived to tell their story. One of the few who did was Alex Weisberg, who may have been spared because he was an Austrian citizen and a well-known scientist. The account he wrote of his experience provides a unique insight into some of the interrogation methods of Stalin's secret police.
Interrogations took place at night. Every time I dropped off to sleep, I would be roughly awoken. At regular intervals, I would be dragged before my interrogators in a state of complete exhaustion. Even the journey to the interrogation room was menacing. The dark, empty corridors, the wire netting on the staircase, the rhythm of the movements, and the echo of boots.
Inside Moscow's Lubyanka prison, Weisberg was interrogated almost constantly, sometimes for 7 days at a time. He was allowed little or no sleep.
Осталась маленькая формальность, только подписать протокол допроса.
Я не могу это подписать.
Не спать, кому сказал!
In the end, Weisberg signed his confession, but 24 hours and a little sleep later, he tore it up.
Что ты тут хотел подписать? Что напомнить хочешь?
Weisberg escaped execution thanks to pressure from the international scientific community, and 3 years after his arrest, he was released.
When after 1934 these trials began, during this period of self-destruction, when ex-members of the NKVD themselves fell under the punishing sword, many interrogators understood what was going on and did not want to charge innocent people. As a result, they themselves became implicated and went to jail.
But suspicion breeds suspicion, and eventually even Nikolai Yezhov, Stalin's main interrogator, came under suspicion. In 1939, he too was arrested, interrogated, and executed. Stalin then made sure Yezhov was airbrushed out of history. Now it is time for our volunteers to experience the snatch technique Yezhov perfected a half-century ago. Although the volunteers know they will be captured, they don't know when, where, or how. From this point on, our volunteers have no idea what will happen to them. but most of them are confident they won't reveal anything.
I don't see how they can make me give anything out. It'd be extremely difficult, I believe, to make us talk.
I want to prepare myself for the worst, absolute worst. So when something bad happens, like, it won't be as bad.
I'm a doctor. Are you willing to go ahead?
Yes.
Going up against experts that are trained by the best training in the world to wear me down.
I'm a doctor. Are you willing to go ahead?
And I get the opportunity to say, no, you've been working on this your whole life. I've never thought about it before, but nah, I'm gonna outfox you. And I think I will.
Up, down, up, down, up, down.
Nobody can prepare you for capture. That is a very frightening experience. But most people seem to be able to just take that in their stride, and then they will try to focus in on coping with capture and interrogation and devising their own strategies to keep control, because it's loss of control that is the thing they most fear.
Our volunteers are brought to an abandoned military hospital where the interrogations will take place. The task facing the interrogators is daunting. They know nothing about the mission the volunteers are on and have to learn as many details as possible before the volunteers are scheduled to be released Sunday afternoon. That gives them just over 24 hours to piece together the secret mission.
The military are taught that nobody is immune to interrogation indefinitely. And what we're trying to do at all times is to give them the wherewithal to hang on for a limited period of time, by which time the information that they hold and which their interrogators are trying to get out of them will be useless.
On arrival, the prisoners are searched for any information that can be used against them later.
Shut up.
To break down the prisoner's personal sense of identity, everyone is stripped, bound, hooded, and given a number to replace their name.
The interrogators are trying to imbue in the prisoners, in the captives all the time, a sense of being out of control. And if you're out of control, you're not going to be able to manage the situation, and they are going to be able to get you to do what you don't want to do and to say what you don't want to say and to reveal information that you want to protect.
The interrogators know that all of the volunteers are tired, hungry, and getting anxious about what will happen next. So they plan to start slowly.
We haven't built up the pressure yet. The white noise will start, and then we start attacking them, in the audio. We'll start another psyops over here with the isolation. And basically that will raise the stress levels.
Answer me.
And we'll start building up the pressure, and we'll start running people through more harsh interrogations.
The first stage of interrogation is screening. The military specialists ask each volunteer a series of simple questions. The answers given reveal the volunteer's basic character traits. A key technique in screening is to closely watch the volunteer's eyes when they're being questioned.
What's your name?
Krishanti Vignoraja.
Who's your next of kin?
My father.
I would ask you a question that I already know the answer to. Your eyes are going to move in a particular direction. And it can be up, mid-range, or down also, and there's different parts of the brain it's accessed. Once we've established the true answers and where your eyes go, then we know when your eyes go a different direction, it's a lie.
Her eyes are very easy to read, so she's a hard right.
She's very, very alert.
More than
not
normal.
Being, tiredness whatsoever.
More than normal.
She's just,
But during this first phase of questioning, Krishanti lets slip the names of the people in her group.
But I came to Aldershot basically, to be honest, as a bet. We had a bet on the Texas Rice game.
Who is we?
My friends, Rick, Callie, and I.
Where?
The interrogators have their first small piece of information. 3 of the volunteers, 3 Americans, know each other. It's not much, but it's a start.
We've given you many options to answer questions. I have all day.
In the Second World War, where time was also of the essence, both the Allies and the Germans interrogated prisoners of war on the field of battle to provide immediate intelligence for the rapid deployment of troops.
Skilled and clever Nazi interrogators grill the prisoners for information as to direction of the Russian withdrawal. The troops quickly move out toward the discovered hideout of retreating Russians.
But behind enemy lines, a different kind of war was being waged, that of the secret agent. Allied spies dropped into occupied Europe knew that if they were caught, they would face a long and brutal interrogation by the German secret police, the Gestapo. An experience few agents survived. Yet every agent knew it was essential to hold out as long as possible. The training for British agents to resist interrogation took place at an old country estate called Beaulieu in the south of England. The secretive organization that trained them was the Special Operations Executive, SOE.
The purpose of the Beaulieu course was really to instruct people in clandestine living, in assuming and being able to support a false identity.
Trainee agents were taught to devise watertight cover stories in case of capture and interrogation. The training at Beaulieu involved simulated interrogations to familiarize agents with the brutal questioning they were likely to face.
They were liable to be woken up in the middle of the night by instructors whom they had not previously met, in some cases dressed in German uniforms, and not physically roughed up, but I mean intimidated in every possible way. This interrogation could last any length of time.
The principal aim of this training was to get the agents to maintain their cover story for at least 48 hours to give other agents time to escape. Our volunteers have been in captivity for only a few hours when their cover stories begin to unravel.
This time, I want you to start from the beginning. You got off the train that you caught in Waterloo. You got off in the station at where?
Aldershot.
Aldershot.
Yeah.
Some of Rick Kelly's teammates have already mentioned the tramp who was one of their secret contacts. When Rick is presented with their version of events, he begins to ad-lib.
So what did you do when you saw this bum?
What's that?
The bum that the other two have talked about. They said they were supposed to be getting something from this bum in town.
I mean, there was a bum on the there's I think more than one.
All three of you were together, so you saw him too.
Well, okay, I mean, fine.
So, no, it's not just fine. That is the truth.
That's bright.
Seeing that Rick is getting rattled, a second interrogator enters the room to increase the pressure.
Hello.
Don't lie to her.
I'm not lying.
You're aware of somebody else coming at you from behind, and you feel very threatened and very out of control. And that's the baseline to all of interrogation, trying to affect the ability to control one's environment.
We're trying to find out where the train station was. The guy wanted a beer. I didn't have enough money, so I just gave him a 50p piece.
You wanted to find out where the train station was when you had already gotten off of the train at the train station, walked into town.
Yeah, absolutely. Look,
Wrong.
I already got us lost once.
Wrong.
I already got...
Look, both of those women you were traveling with have told us.
During the Second World War, one of the agents trained by the SOE was Jean Holly, a clandestine radio operator operating in German-occupied France. Holly expected to be tortured and shot if he was caught sending the large number of messages he was responsible for every week.
I had heard of the Gestapo and I was familiar with their methods. I expected to be tortured and then shot. We were supposed to transmit 3 20-minute messages a week, but I actually worked through the night because I had so many messages. All of the other radio operators had been arrested and the messages had to get through.
Using radio tracking devices, the Germans were eventually able to locate Jean Holly. When they showed up to arrest him, the radio man got out of the house, but only made it as far as the railway station before he was arrested.
Halt, stehen geblieben, Freundchen, nach dir. Wir sind seit Monaten gesucht.
Holly was taken to the notorious Hotel Terminus in the center of Lyon, where the Gestapo had set up an interrogation center on 2 of its floors. Then he was beaten.
They had prepared a list of questions and asked the questions one by one. After each answer, they would hit me until I had changed my mind. As I didn't change my mind at all, they decided that what I was saying was true. So they would ask the next question, and we continued like this. But they never compared the answers. Never. They weren't at all psychological in their methods.
The methods the Gestapo used were extremely brutal. They could vary from pulling out of fingernails, toenails, the crushing of various parts of the anatomy, genitalia included, and the well-known or reputedly well-known baignoire, which was immersing someone in a cold bath and pressing their face down underwater for as long as they could stand it and carry on doing that during the interrogation.
The Gestapo occupied the top 2 floors of the Hotel Terminus near la Gare Perrache in Lyon. The rest of the hotel was filled with ordinary guests. During the interrogation, the Germans asked me at one point to shout more quietly. I replied by asking them not to hit me as hard. But they didn't have a sense of humor, and it continued as before.
Despite his brutal treatment, Holly was able to keep vital information from his interrogators.
In reply to the German questions, I denied any knowledge of where the messages were going. In fact, I pretended to be an idiot, and they accepted this.
Our volunteers have had no training in resistance techniques, and one of them, David DeChambeau, number 18, has made the tactical decision not to answer any questions.
What's your phone number? Here? Here. Not going to tell you. Who's your next of kin? It could become important to you. Not going to tell you. What is your address? Not going to tell you. What is your phone number? Not going to tell you.
Dave believes he can hold out for 20 hours without responding, but in doing so, he becomes the focus of attention for the interrogators. When he's brought back to the room where the others are being put into stress positions, Dave refuses to say anything at all.
Take a good, hard look. She's been there as long as you have, and look at her hands.
Get your hands off the rope, Portini.
That's down to you.
Maybe you should
You can make this stop.
show him 14 as well. He's been here longer.
He's in the real estate. That's down to you. Your stupidity. You can make it stop.
The volunteers' bound hands have been stretched over a rope above shoulder level. The effort required to keep the arms raised is beginning to cause pain in the shoulder joint, neck, and back. They've been at the detention center for about 3 hours. So far, the interrogators have learned a few disconnected facts, and one of the volunteers isn't speaking at all. But they still have nearly 20 hours to expose this secret plan, and the stress positions are beginning to take their toll on the volunteers. But number 18 still isn't talking.
You've heard everybody else speak, and you won't speak. What's wrong with you? Are you stupid?
During the Second World War, a large number of American and Allied airmen were shot down by the German Luftwaffe in the early 1940s. Most of them ended up at Dulag Luft, the main Luftwaffe interrogation center. It was here that hundreds of prisoners were interrogated by a Luftwaffe private named Hans Scharf. Scharf's wife was British, which made him ineligible for officer status. But he spoke fluent English, and he quickly developed an unconventional but highly successful approach to gaining information.
The prisoners were brought to my father's office, and he would get up and welcome them.
Why don't you take a seat?
Do you smoke? He'd give them tea or coffee if they wanted, give them cigarettes if they smoked.
Take a few.
Sure.
Yeah, of course.
Make them feel as comfortable as possible.
He was a uniquely charming person and was an easy person to talk to. He had a lot of humor, he could tell a lot of jokes, and those were characteristics which were very, very unexpected by his prisoners because they had been indoctrinated to expect much harsher treatment.
Under his gentle questioning, many prisoners shared apparently trivial information with Scharf. Things like which squadron they came from and where it was based. Over time, Scharf was able to build up an incredibly detailed picture on how the American Air Corps was structured. But he was also brilliant at gaining specific intelligence. On one occasion, the Luftwaffe High Command wanted to know why the Americans fired white tracers instead of red ones from their planes. Hans Scharf took one of the prisoners for a long walk in the woods and got the answer he needed in the course of a friendly chat.
But there are problems on the basis with you Americans. Yeah, the British, they ran out of the red chemicals for the tracer bullets.
What do you mean?
Well, apparently they have no red chemicals left. It's just white tracer bullets, which is difficult for the pilots to see. It's strange.
No, you don't understand. What we do is we load white tracers close to the end of the chain, so we'll know we're running out of ammo and we can return safely to get more ammo.
Ah, of course. How stupid of me.
After the war, Scharf moved to the U.S., where his experience in soft interrogation was put to use by the U.S. military.
My father's influence is still alive today. I know that they are using his methods in the interrogation of Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan.
Scharf was fastidious in his preparation for an interview and wanted to know as much as possible about the backgrounds of the men he was questioning. It was a lesson that should have been followed by one of our interrogators, who is trying to get information by pretending to be a German journalist reporting on the weekend's events, but he hasn't done his homework.
This is for Blitz, Blitz.com. We are a magazine.
This particular volunteer, it turns out, is fluent in German. And the phony German journalist isn't.
English. Please, we're doing this in English. Okay, yes.
Unfortunately, I got a prisoner who is in her third year of German at the university. And I really didn't want her to test my German because my German really isn't that good. So I was able to get her away from German, but she was very, very suspicious.
Did they give you like documents to carry through and take to certain places, or I don't understand.
I don't want to talk about that yet.
Okay, this is fine.
Inside the makeshift detention center, interrogator Scharf's friendly approach most definitely isn't being followed. Our volunteers are now in their 8th hour of captivity. They're all exhausted, hungry, and cold. And number 18 is still refusing to talk.
Tell me your number.
If someone looked at this and said this is not stressful, I can assure you it was very stressful. There was just no let up. It was in your face. It didn't go away. Everything from the white noise to sitting on a concrete floor. Every time you felt like you were on your own and no one was watching you, someone would immediately come back and be back in your face going, don't scratch your face, don't move. So where it literally, you had no idea if there was nobody watching you or there was 10 people watching at any given time.
The stress positions were so completely uncomfortable. The blindfolds, the orange jumpsuits, the manacles on your ankles, the way your wrists are tethered so you can't use your hands. It was hard because you become confused and disoriented. And when you become exhausted, it was difficult to concentrate.
With number 18, the interrogators use other members of the group to apply pressure.
What number do you read on his hand?
Put him on the rope. Number 14 is leaning on the rope.
18.
Pressure is brought to bear upon an individual who says nothing at all. Immediately, he begins to recognize that I've done one thing I shouldn't have done. I've drawn attention to myself. And that's a chink in his armor. And from there on, they've got something with which to work and to break him down.
Number 18 gets to sit down and lower his arms. But his two companions must stay in this paralyzing position.
I felt guilty, certainly, for the apparent escalation in punishment that everybody was getting. After a while, they stopped punishing me, frankly. They were punishing everyone else. which frankly did not make it any easier. I would prefer they just punished me. My immediate gut reaction was, oh, I've got to talk, I've got to tell you everything. We can't punish other people because I'm not talking.
And you're sat in a chair. You can stop this.
In the early part of the Second World War, the British Secret Service persuaded Churchill that captured spies should not automatically be killed. They insisted that with the right interrogation methods, German agents could be turned and be persuaded to work for the Allies as a double agent. These interrogations took place here at Camp 020 on the outskirts of London. It was the first dedicated interrogation center of its kind in Britain. Camp 020 was run by the authoritarian Colonel Robin Stevens, known as Tin Eye, because of his ever-present monocle.
He really had two sides to his character. His interrogator side, if you like, where he was the fierce, uncompromising interrogator, and then behind the scenes, a much more subtle thinker, thinking of psychological techniques to get the spies to admit their guilt.
Stevens thought up numerous novel techniques in his attempt to break prisoners. One method he used to create fear and uncertainty in a prisoner was to threaten them with cell 14.
This, in fact, was an empty padded cell that had left over from the First World War, but Colonel Stevens used this as a psychological tool against his prisoners, suggesting that certain practices might take place in this cell and then threatening to take them there.
To undermine morale, Stevens provided prisoners with fake copies of German newspapers reporting how poorly the war was going for the fatherland. But it was in the interrogation room that Stevens developed his most famous techniques.
One that he favored was the good cop, bad cop scenario, which most people would be familiar with if they'd seen any 1970s cop show. Essentially, Stevens would present himself as an uncompromising, fierce interrogator, where a secondary officer would take a much softer stance and try and goad the prisoner into admitting his guilt.
In 1940, a man named Wolf Schmidt, who claimed to be a Danish citizen fleeing the Germans, came to Stevens's attention. Stevens was convinced the man was a German spy and subjected him to a typical first interrogation. Toward the end, Stevens implied that Schmidt would be executed, while his aide held open the possibility that he might be able to save himself. It surprised no one that Schmidt ended up confessing and making a deal.
What was key quite often in the break situation when the spy got to actually admit his guilt was the prospect of execution. You cannot discount the pressure of self-preservation.
Codenamed Tate, Schmidt became a spy for the Allies and sent the Germans a great deal of misinformation for the remainder of the war.
He was highly successful at this. He served throughout the war, and in fact the Germans decorated him on 2 occasions, earning the Iron Cross first and second class.
His false reports were an important part of the Allied plan to deceive the Germans about the time and place of the D-Day invasions that turned the tide of the war. Hour 11 of captivity. In our simulated interrogation, Ben Funk is being examined by a bad cop. He has alcohol on his breath and blood on his knuckles. The idea is to get Ben worried that this particular guard is a loose cannon and might pose an actual physical threat.
What were you here for?
I knew it was just a game. But when you're in the middle of it, it's all around you. It's unrelenting. Little by little, the fantasy turns to a nightmare, and the nightmare turns to reality. And it sounds absurd, but it did feel very real.
What is this, alcohol that I smell?
No.
Then Ben is rescued. A female guard tells the bad cop to calm down and orders him out of the room.
When the brute left and the kinder woman came in, it was a relief. It relaxed me. I was able to speak with her. She was rational. She wanted to talk. as opposed to someone just in my face yelling. It was certainly easier to communicate with her than with the beast. Pop around. I didn't even know if I was gonna.
The female guard makes sure Ben's okay and then continues the questioning in a much softer way. Ben still isn't talking, but if he ever does want to make a deal, he knows who to ask. An analysis of a prisoner's personality is essential in helping to decide whether the stick or the carrot is more likely to get results.
The greatest war crimes trial in modern history proceeds at Nuremberg with Hermann Goering.
In 1946, at the end of the Second World War, Nazi war criminals were tried at Nuremberg in Germany.
These pictures reveal the arrogance with which the German warlords meet the charges of criminal injustice to civilized people.
The more the interrogators knew about the prisoner's personality quirks, the more likely they could exploit them to gain information or a confession.
There was a certain premium on understanding what made each defendant tick and to play on their weaknesses as much as possible and to get them to reveal things that they would not have revealed unless we had a psychological hook, so to speak, to get them to talk.
Hermann Goering was Hitler's second in command, and his vanity was legendary.
His two weaknesses were his bragging. I mean, his bragging was famous in Germany, and the second, to do everything he could to save or establish his reputation to become a genuine martyr. And we played on that as much as we could.
One of the ways the interrogators used Goering's vanity against him was to confront him with another major figure from the Nazi regime, Rudolf Hess, who was once Hitler's deputy and was faking amnesia to avoid being prosecuted. A meeting between the two men was arranged. Hess continued to remember nothing about anything, and it had the effect the interrogators were hoping for.
Hermann drew himself up and he says, "Rudolf, don't you recognize me? I was the second man in Germany. I was the president of the Reichstag. You don't remember that? I was one of your old comrades. I was the Reichsmarschall. I was the head of the Luftwaffe." To all of which Hess responded, "Sorry to disappoint you. I can't remember." And the net result was that Goering was led out of the interrogation room completely crushed because he had assumed that his exalted personality would jar Hess out of his amnesia.
The interrogations at Nuremberg were vital for the prosecution of the war criminals, but they were also significant because the information was obtained without physical force.
Any methods of extortion or forceful extraction of confessions would have become public knowledge. And we wanted to make sure that the world would look upon this trial later as a fair trial, not just an act of revenge by the victors against the defeated.
Following the verdicts, Hess was sentenced to life in Berlin's Spandau prison. Goering committed suicide, and 11 of the 21 remaining high-ranking Nazi officials were executed. The end of World War II ushered in a new kind of war, the Cold War, fought between totalitarian communist states and Western democracies. Instead of meeting on the battlefield, each side tried to infiltrate and undermine the other from within. So the soldiers in this war were spies.
Underlining the menace from within was Valentin Gubichev. This Soviet functionary in the United Nations was deported following his conviction.
The Soviet Union was desperate to get information about the atomic bomb the United States had used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so they planted spies in America's fledgling nuclear establishment. Some of the spies' radio transmissions were intercepted by a top-secret listening project called Venona, which would have been compromised had the Soviets learned of its existence.
Venona was a top-secret compartmented a source, and you could never be used in a prosecution. It was so secret, it could never be used in a confrontation with an individual who had been identified as a Soviet spy. So interrogators and interviewers were faced with the dilemma, how do I go and talk to somebody that I know is a spy and get them to confess without telling them how I know they're a spy. So in essence, the interview or the interrogation became the king. It became the only way you could prove these cases.
In 1950, the key to unraveling the Soviets' atomic spy network turned out to be the interrogation of one man, German-born physicist Klaus Fuchs.
Klaus Fuchs, operating in England, was a key figure in the conspiracy to steal the atomic bomb. The Venona source identified him as a Russian spy, but you could not use that in the interview.
In order to persuade Fuchs to confess, British intelligence brought in their chief interrogator, William Scarden. Scarden's approach was to play on Fuchs's sense of guilt.
He interviewed him on 4 separate occasions over many hours and managed to build up a rapport with Fuchs. But it was on the 4th occasion that Scarden said to Fuchs, you know, you must unburden your conscience, let me help you. And during this period, they in fact went out to lunch. It was a very informal situation, and Fuchs finally caved in at that point and did in fact unburden his conscience as William Scarden had suggested.
Fuchs's confession led to the uncovering of more spies at the top-secret atomic laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico.
David Greenglass confessed theft of the secrets while stationed at the Los Alamos atomic project.
Confessions are something that people want to get off their chest. I mean, we find this happening in relationships between husband and wife, where one wants to confess. It doesn't ever do them any good to confess, but it makes you feel better to get it off because there's such a burden.
The confessions of Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass were instrumental in identifying Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel as Soviet spies. Both were convicted of espionage and executed.
Is the one who got you captured.
Our interrogators are also pushing hard to get confessions. They've found an inconsistency in 2 of the cover stories and are putting pressure on Callie to see if she'll incriminate one of her companions.
Why is he not telling the truth?
I don't know.
Why shouldn't I believe that he's telling the truth? Because why?
Because I'm the one telling the truth.
Very good. That's all I needed to hear. That's all I needed to hear. I have that on tape. You are the one telling the truth.
I don't know what the truth is anymore.
Callie is now cold, tired, and demoralized, thinking she has inadvertently incriminated a friend. She is now taken to a quiet room where she is sequestered with a friendly guard who isn't on the interrogation team. At least, she doesn't think he is. The interrogator creates an immediate rapport by showing Callie that he is looking after her personal possessions.
I'm not sure.
He chats with her, trying to get her to feel more at ease.
They don't let me move you around. After I left you, some other people came in here, but only for about 5 minutes.
He takes his time building up her confidence and gaining her trust.
Watching these all when they were moving you around. And then some of them took that big fat guy outside and ran around.
After a while, the interrogator gives Callie a chocolate biscuit, a simple gift that produces remarkable results. Without being prodded, she starts to give out details of her secret mission and a description of her contacts.
What do they look like? No, what do they look like? The people in town, because I might know them.
There were 2 twins. They were twins, and they have short hair. And then we just met this bum in this guy, and I've been.
With the medical center, she talks about code words.
Like, we just say like a code word or something like that, maybe. And then they'll know that's a code word because not a lot of people would ask for that, right? So then we can read it like this envelope with the information on it.
So you ask for a stretcher and they give you an envelope?
Yeah, something like that, you know, like something you would never ask.
In the space of a few minutes, Callie gives up all sorts of important information. The interrogator pieces together the key facts and reports back to the rest of his team.
There, they went and met their first contact, who, as they put it, was a bum, who they had to use a code phrase, basically asking where the cinema was. From there, he gave them an envelope, which gave them directions to meet a contact in a cafe. They went to the cafe and they met a contact, which were 2 women who were kind of like twins but not identical. They believed the women to be in their 50s. During those 4 contacts, they received an envelope with information in, and that's what they've got to hide.
Fine. It's a really good approach. That's a nice one.
Yeah, it's been working well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You got more information than all of us, probably.
It's textbook.
Yeah, it is textbook. That's what's funny. Is we forget that stuff works because most on soldiers, they go, not going to work.
But even soldiers well trained in resisting interrogation are sometimes as unprepared as Cali for new types of interrogation.
The Republic of Korea and the United Nations fought to repel this new invasion.
When communist North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, it was the beginning of one of the great conflicts of the Cold War. Within months, American forces had landed to support the South Koreans, and the Chinese army had intervened on behalf of North Korea. As the war ebbed and flowed, thousands of U.S. troops were taken prisoner by the North Koreans and subjected to interrogations unlike any that had gone before.
What American troops were exposed to was something troubling that extended quite beyond ordinary, expectable interrogation.
The shocking new development was the attempt by the communists to use the interrogation process to brainwash American POWs.
What happened in North Korea to American POWs was an application of a process which the Chinese specifically called thought reform. And the idea of thought reform was not only to confess one's ills, but to be remade into a different person, to have one's identity changed, one's sense of oneself.
These techniques had their roots in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, when young activists had taken the revolution into the countryside to convert the peasantry to Mao's new version of communism.
The re-education process was a systematic way of getting into people's heads and into their lives. Behind this was a religious zealotry of getting rid of all thoughts, all mindsets of the past in order to create new men and women in a perfect new society. Of course, it couldn't achieve that, but that was the vision.
资本主义是美好生活。
In the POW camps, prisoners were educated about the evils of capitalism.
美国人
The ultimate aim of the Chinese was to get American prisoners to broadcast propaganda on behalf of the communists. And eventually, several American pilots gave press conferences denouncing their own country.
When my son asked me what I did in Korea, how can I tell him that I came over here and dropped germ bombs on people, destroying them, bringing death and destruction? How can I go back and face my family? In a civilized world, how can I tell them these things, that I'm a criminal in the eyes of humanity?
This was the first time that military prisoners of war had been subjected to propaganda questioning. And propaganda had taken a completely different turn than the normal interrogation that we would have expected based on what we were getting in World War II and what we thought we'd get if we got shot down.
When Bud Mahiran's airplane was hit over North Korea in May 1951, he quickly discovered that his interrogators wanted more than information. They wanted a confession that American pilots were involved in germ warfare. Kept in solitary confinement for 16 months of his captivity, Mahiran was subjected to a range of interrogation techniques.
They started to interrogate for long hours. I got very little food and practically no sleep at all. And there were teams of interrogators that would come in and continue to ask questions. I'd continue to not answer. They'd continue to keep me awake, and as a result, I'm gradually losing it. Now, this took a long period of time, and eventually it got to the point where there were a dozen or so interrogators around in a circle, and each one of them would ask questions.
Say it, it's your last chance.
So it's pretty easy to create a confession in hopes it would be successful and I'd get to go home, and be misleading to the point where anybody that read it would know that it was crazy. If the confession was printed then at least they would know back home, my family would, that I was still alive.
It was clear that the training pilots had received to resist interrogation was inadequate to cope with political indoctrination.
My age is 27. Some were dazed and shocked. Evidence of the communist brainwashing technique.
Americans had been trained to give name, rank, and serial number. Not everybody can live up to doing just that, but they had no expectation that their entire political history would be in some way subject to examination.
At the detention center, the volunteers have been in captivity for about 12 hours. Clearly, no one's been brainwashed. But the would-be secret agents have already given away so much information that the interrogators now have an overview of their mission.
And I know you've done kind of a friendly guard approach, and it seems to be highly effective. Yeah. So if we could talk about what you've accomplished with 23 and 5, I mean, I think that would be good.
They've explained how they went down into the town itself. They moved for a series of contacts. One of the first contacts being in the general medical store, where they had to ask for a lightweight stretcher. However, once they asked for that, which was the cover word, as it were, they were given an envelope with details in. From there, they moved off to a cafe and met two twins, two sisters. Again, there was an exchange of information. From there, they moved around and met, as they call it, a bum or a tramp. Again, there was an exchange of information there.
The interrogators have identified 3 of the 4 contacts.
Which was a phone contact.
In addition, they've identified that there's information that definitely...
And they know someone is making a getaway on an airplane flight.
Details for flights. I can't get to locations yet, but it's definitely...
Now they need details, and they still have 12 hours to get them.
They're supposed to call this number, use this code.
By the 1960s, the capture and interrogation of spies and double agents was an essential part of trying to defeat the enemy during the Cold War. Oleg Penkovsky was the most important spy working for the West at that time. He was a colonel in Soviet military intelligence and funneled huge amounts of classified information to the Americans. But by November 1962, the Russians had become suspicious of Penkovsky and put him under surveillance. This is the actual footage shot by the KGB of Penkovsky on his way back from meeting one of his contacts. He was also filmed dropping secret documents to his American and British handlers. With their suspicions confirmed, he was arrested and then questioned by Major Alexander Zagvozdin at KGB headquarters.
When our people went to his apartment to detain him, we knew that he kept his equipment and other evidence of espionage activities inside his desk.
The Russians filmed the wide variety of espionage equipment they found in Penkovsky's flat.
There were film rolls there, cameras, secret codes, as well as a passport in a different name, but with Penkovsky's photograph on.
This incriminating evidence was the key in Major Zagvozdin's initial interrogation of Penkovsky, which the KGB filmed.
Там его уже ждали английские и американские разведчики.
Выглядел, если можно сказать, мокрой курицей.
He looked like a wet chicken to me.
Он был весьма растерян.
It seemed to me he was very much at a loss, pale, and even shaken a little.
Как мне показалось, дрожал.
Faced with overwhelming evidence, Penkovsky confessed to being a spy within 20 minutes. But the KGB knew he was still withholding important information.
Шпионов допрашивают десятки раз.
Spies are interrogated dozens of times, so they would confess bit by bit everything they had done while working with foreign intelligence services. No spy can confess all, even if he wants to. Spies who confess all at once are rare.
I think the KGB was intelligent enough to realize that this was not the kind of man to beat up on. That this was a man that you sat down with, tried to speak and carry on a discourse, always centering on the good treatment that the KGB was willing to give his wife and son.
He
played with us, we played with him. We knew he remembered a lot, but simply wanted to spend a little longer playing and hide more from us.
Knowing his American handlers might not even be aware he'd been arrested, Penkovsky stalled for time. Then he began to divulge some operational details while withholding others.
On November 2nd, a CIA officer went out on the street to pick up information from Penkovsky. That operation had been put in motion by the KGB because Penkovsky was already in custody, and they had initiated an emergency call-out signal. So a man by the name of Jacobs, who was a CIA officer in Moscow, went out to fill the drop, or clear the drop from Penkovsky and fill a drop for information to him. He was arrested by the KGB. When he was in the car, the two KGB officers who were asking him, who are you? And he said he was an American diplomat. They said, no, you're not. You're a British diplomat. And that statement proved that Penkovsky had not told his interrogators that he was working for the Americans and the Brits, but only the Brits.
Penkovsky also tried to convince the KGB that he'd only been spying for the West for a few months, but the KGB eventually broke him. And in this extraordinary footage, Penkovsky admits he'd been spying since 1960.
В ноябре 1960 года я решил войти в контакт с американской разведкой, для чего я подготовил письмо, в котором высказал эту.
In the end, Penkovsky gave up almost all the details of his espionage activities, which allowed the Soviets to repair the damage to their security apparatus. He also provided a propaganda coup by making a confession, which was probably extracted by handing Penkovsky a ray of hope during the interrogations.
The Russians had a very interesting way when they interrogated somebody. The only way, comrade, to save yourself, they would say, is to completely cooperate with us. And if you do, you may save your life. Generally, that doesn't work. Generally, that is a ploy to get the individual to completely cooperate, and then they still would execute them.
Oleg Penkovsky was tried and convicted of treason and was executed by firing squad in May 1963.
Every man always hopes for the best. Hope dies last. He asked what punishment he was going to receive, and I always told him it was up to the court. And in fact, the decision rests with the court. There are 3 generals there, I told him, while I was only a lieutenant colonel. Penkovsky did not repent, and therefore signed his own verdict.
During this period in the U.S., the CIA and the military were researching new interrogation techniques, concentrating on psychological methods. Experiments included the use of drugs, though the results were never as good as people had envisioned.
The trouble with using drugs is that oftentimes your subject certainly will yield information, but it may be a half-truth, it may be hallucinated, it may not be totally on the mark because he's so disoriented. Drugs really don't work unless you're looking for a very specific kind of information, the name of a spy, the name of a colleague. But if you want somebody to discuss strategic intelligence, what the adversary is going to do next, or what the terrorist cell is going to do next, you're not going to get it.
Some of the most significant research projects involved placing a person in isolation and removing their ability to see and hear for long periods of time.
The CIA, I think, sadly and wrongly, began to be drawn to something quite exciting in their eyes that the communists had hold of. And so they wanted to find ways of manipulating the mind. They sometimes tried sensory deprivation, which really means cutting out one's perceptions, the influences of the environment on one, withdrawing a person from it in order to make them more malleable for change, for what can be put into their minds.
Our volunteers are not being subjected to drugs, but they are experiencing other techniques developed in the 60s, like sensory deprivation, that can have drug-like effects on the mind.
You can be distorted in your perception of hearing, seeing, taste, touch, smell, even position sense, to the extent that you believe that you're upside down when in fact you're right way up, or that you're smelling something that isn't there, or you're seeing something that isn't there. That's a well-recognized form of abnormal stressor that may well lead to people having difficulty in coping then with being asked routine questions, the question to which you should not reply.
Almost constantly blindfolded, the volunteers are not allowed to speak unless spoken to.
To lose your sight when you become so dependent on it it's brutal.
They are constantly bombarded by white noise, everything from static to a baby crying.
Having baby noise scream at me for 2 hours. It was pretty intense.
David DeChambeau, number 18, still hasn't said a word since his initial interrogation, so he's been separated from the others.
Take off your blindfold.
My understanding of the reason why people decide not to talk is that they are going to believe in the fact that if I say nothing at all, that is safer than saying just a limited amount of information. So in a sense, I suppose, he feels more in control by saying nothing at all, whereas in fact what he's really doing is drawing attention to himself.
You think that sitting silently is a wise move? Have you done something that you feel like you shouldn't talk? Bring me the woman.
Callie is brought in and made to perform push-ups while being yelled at.
We can start with something simple. Maybe push-ups.
Now!
Faster.
The reason why interrogators might bring in a female and punish that female in the presence of a male volunteer is to respond to the natural instinct on the part of the male to protect the female.
Do more push-ups. Maybe that's what you like. See other people suffer for your good, yes?
Not to so respond would indue a feeling of guilt in the male volunteer that they could work on, they could use to diminish his concept of his manhood.
Don't know him! He's number 18. He won't even tell me his name.
But number 18 maintains his stoic silence. The interrogators decide to isolate Dave completely and let him listen to a tape of a baby crying while he thinks things over. The war in Vietnam was to prove the next major chapter in the development of 20th century interrogation. In the desperate battle to uncover information on the enemy, both the North and South Vietnamese forces used brutal methods. So did the Americans, for the most part indirectly.
Oftentimes the Americans would threaten, for instance, to turn a Viet Cong cadre over to our South Vietnamese allies and close our eyes and turn our backs, knowing that the communists would think, well, I'm going to be tortured. And in fact, that would happen. The Americans didn't need to do their torturing. They didn't need to use strong-arm tactics because we could rely on our allies to put the fear of God into our adversaries.
The surprise attack by the North Vietnamese during the Tet Offensive exposed America's lack of detailed intelligence about the enemy. Subsequently, intense pressure was put upon interrogators to extract better, or at least more, information from prisoners. And there weren't enough trained interrogators available.
Oftentimes, because we were using not experts to do the interrogations in the field, but people seconded from the U.S. military, we would use the worst kind of tactics. They would be beaten up, they would be tormented. Well, if you put somebody under that kind of pressure, what he's going to tell you is whatever will relieve the pain. And it's never strategic intelligence. It can often be terribly inaccurate. And as time went on, we began to discover that many of the reports that had been generated during that post-Tet period were inaccurate.
As a young interrogator in Vietnam, Frank Snepp realized that a focused psychological approach would probably work best. When he interrogated Nguyen Van Thai, America's most important prisoner, Snepp skillfully used his knowledge of Vietnamese cultural beliefs to weaken the prisoner's resolve.
Do you hear me? Who is your next of kin? What about your father?
He was immediately placed in solitary confinement in a snow-white room. We over-refrigerated the room. We had too much air conditioning because we knew that the Vietnamese believed that when exposed to cold air, their veins would shrink up.
Snepp played on the fact that he was younger than Van Thai.
There is a great sense of hierarchy in the Vietnamese culture. Why was this kid, which I was in those days, put up against Nguyen Van Thai? Because we knew that he would feel insulted to have such a junior character, me, dealing with him. And he would rage. He would be contemptuous. He would refuse to believe that I might be one step ahead of him. Then when I managed to be, his vanity would come into play and he would shout. He would give out more than he meant to.
Snepp also exploited a secret he knew about the prisoner's past.
I knew that he had betrayed his father on the way up the party ladder, and I used it with him.
Tell me your father's name. You too ashamed to tell me your father's name?
You venerate old age, but if I, as the young interrogator, do not venerate old age, if I don't venerate the senior category, if I say, you know something, you betrayed your father. How could you do that in your culture? I don't know anything about your culture, but I do know that's wrong. And do it enough, and he begins to break down.
Information from other prisoners played a big part in the interrogation, pitting one comrade against another.
I was interrogating at one point, when I had him under my lens, 8 other communist cadre, many of them from the same territory, from the same political elements. And so I would go into one interrogation, pick up a little bit here, take it into his interrogation, play it back to him, lead him to believe that one of his colleagues, one of his comrades was giving away much more than he actually was. That was a major element in my approach to this guy.
Snepp eventually broke Nguyen Van Thai, and the communist gave up accurate information about North Vietnamese operations in and around Saigon. The techniques he used, a mixture of sensory deprivation, psychological ploys, and playing one prisoner off against another, are now standard interrogation practices. Our interrogators have used this combination for the past 14 hours, and the volunteers are beyond the point of thinking clearly. Callie is about to be asked to do something she was explicitly warned against at the orientation yesterday morning.
Remember what you can and can't talk about. This mission, you do not talk about your mission. You do not sign anything. Write confessions. Okay? You do not talk about your personal family details. They're the things to remember.
What do you want me to do?
I want you to simply write that you did not cause Rick's capture and that you were simply going to visit Rick's friend.
Callie only writes down the details of her cover story and says nothing about the real mission.
Put your initials above this so everyone knows I didn't change it for you.
But the interrogator has now got a copy of her handwriting and her signature.
The volunteers are instructed that the one thing they mustn't do is to produce a signature on a piece of paper, because that can then be transferred to any document in which the captor might choose to write out and make all sorts of claims.
The interrogator then deftly manipulates Krishanti into agreeing to write and sign a statement.
I would suggest you trust me.
And you would swear to this? You would swear to this?
Yes, I would.
In writing?
Yes, I would.
Beyond her signature, there's no useful information here, but it is a sign she's becoming compliant.
What were your friends' names that you were betting with?
Well, it was a whole group of them. But it was everyone, including my cousin Kavita.
You can list your friends if you'd like.
Here?
Yes.
When the interrogator begins to give the volunteer instructions and the volunteer begins to respond to those instructions, that's a clear example of the interrogator gaining control of the volunteer.
Certify that if this is in conflict with any other statement, then your statement is accurate and correct and the others aren't.
With the realization of that, which may not be for some time on the part of the volunteer, comes a sense of defeat, that the interrogator now is totally in control of me and there is really no point in my continuing to resist, and I might as well cooperate fully with him.
I'll do what I can for you, and I will let you know.
The interrogators now have 2 statements, which they can compare, and 2 signatures. They decide to put Krishanti in a small room with Callie and the friendly guard and film them surreptitiously to see if they reveal anything useful. They do. The women compare notes in a whisper on the false stories they've told, but the microphone picks it up. Up until the Vietnam War, the U.S. military encouraged American soldiers who were captured and interrogated to stick to the code of conduct, which meant giving out only name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. But in the jungles of Vietnam, one prisoner set an example of a heroic defiance which transformed the U.S. military's approach to interrogation training.
Now, I lived under what the Viet Cong called their lenient and humane policy for 5 years and 2 months.
Nick was working in the Delta of Vietnam in October of 1963, and he was going out on a patrol with a Vietnamese unit. Along with him on the patrol was Sergeant Dan Pitzer and Captain Rocky Versace. And while they were on the patrol, they encountered the Viet Cong. They were taken under fire. They were overwhelmed, and Nick and Dan and Rocky were all captured.
Lieutenant Nick Rowe was a Special Forces officer, but when he was interrogated, instead of not answering questions, he feigned cooperation while feeding the North Vietnamese a cleverly crafted cover story filled with misinformation.
Nick was very crafty in that regard, and he never gave them exactly what they wanted. He told them all kinds of tall tales. He made up his own assignment. He made up units. He misled them to the point where they couldn't tell that he was outright lying, but it took them a long time to find out that he wasn't fully telling the truth. And by doing that, that helped him stay alive for a much longer period of time, because if they knew that they could have gotten more information from him, they would have tortured him much, much worse than they did.
Lieutenant Rowe's approach was a sharp contrast to that of Rocky Versace, who was captured alongside him.
Rocky was a very hard line, these are my beliefs and you won't shake me a bit. And he was very stern and solid, appropriately enough, like a rock. And I think that the VC just saw that they would never ever be able to break Rocky. And they got angry at him, and he told them, for example, you can make me sit here and listen, you can tell me all your lies, but you will never make me believe what it is you're saying to me. And as a result of that, they executed him.
The defiance shown by Rocky Versace is also present in David DeChambeau, number 18. He hasn't said a word for the past 15 hours, nor has he drunk any water. The interrogators are concerned for his health.
The doctor told me that you need to drink water, you need to cooperate. If you talk with us or not, that's your decision.
After getting medical attention and a hot drink, Dave is placed in isolation where he must sit on the floor, once again listening to a baby crying.
Segregation is the most powerful form of punishment we have. You take one person, put him by himself, and then everything that's gone wrong starts to roll back on him. Right now, if you probably talk to the psychologist, if this man were isolated with all the problems that he's just generated for other people, then he has to deal with that very personally, and he can't. Ideally, he will at least realize that he's made a bad decision.
You are a dumbass. Let's go.
After a prolonged period of time on his own, David DeChambeau, cold and tired, is taken back to the questioning room to see if his attitude has changed.
Glad to be away from that baby crying? Yes. Grates on the nerves, doesn't it? It does. Glad to hear you talking.
Yeah, well, it's actually good to be talking.
Where'd you get your mission from? That's what I want to know.
I don't have a mission.
Dave is talking, but he still won't answer any questions.
Do I get my blanket?
Lieutenant Nick Rowe spent 5 years living almost entirely in solitary confinement and being tortured without ever breaking. To keep his mind active, he constructed mental exercises for himself, which he kept in a diary.
He used all the knowledge he had as training and as an engineer at West Point and other places to go through all the processes he would of building a ranch or a house or whatever, a business. All the exercises he would go through, the plans, the specific types of materials he would use, and those kinds of things in order to keep sanity, I guess is a good word, to maintain a bridge back to civilization and the things that he was not seeing living in a cage in the Delta in Vietnam.
And throughout his captivity, Nick Rowe kept the truth of his identity as a Special Forces officer from his interrogators, persuading them he was merely an engineer. Ironically, Nick Rowe's cover story was eventually blown when his true identity was published in the United States.
Nick Rowe's captors found out that he was a Special Forces officer, that he had been leading them along for a long period of time, and that he had been telling them lies and fabricating stories for the better part of 5 years. They were on their way to take him to some other location from where he had been last in captivity to be executed.
But fate, or sheer luck, intervened. As Rowe was being moved, American helicopters just happened to fly over the condemned man and his guards.
Nick ran out into a field and waved his hands to be picked up. And when Nick was asked later what happened, he said, "My guards suddenly became incapacitated." I think Nick hit him over the head or something.
After the war, Nick Rowe went on to train at the military Sears School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where Special Forces troops are trained in interrogation survival techniques.
It became a personal obsession of his to produce some training to give soldiers the ability to survive the type of scenario that he had been faced to survive, to give them the tools, if you will, to be able to do the things that he had to invent or make up on his own because they didn't exist at the time.
You realize that we've got a code that gives us a direction and a purpose. You take your own faiths and your loyalties and beliefs, that's to your country, to your God, to the people in your unit, to the military. These are the things that push you from day to day and keep you going. The code gives you that direction.
In 1989, while in Manila advising the Philippine military on counter-terrorist techniques, Nick Rowe was killed by a sniper's bullet. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, signaling the end of the Cold War, there was a shift in the way intelligence was gathered. The revolution in information technology led to an increasing reliance on high-tech surveillance as a tool for collecting information. Interrogation as a collection tool began to take a back seat. On the 11th of September, a whole new battlefield was created, with a new kind of enemy. Interrogation was once again to become a major weapon in the war against terror.
Post 9/11, we've discovered that interrogation is absolutely key. It's a key element in the intelligence gathering process. We have yet to develop really good penetration networks inside the terrorist cells. So when you nab a top-ranking terrorist, number 2 and number 3 in Al-Qaeda, you've got to immediately begin applying interrogation techniques.
I have to say that all you need to know is that there was a before 9/11 and there was an after 9/11. After 9/11, the gloves come off.
This is the notorious Camp X-Ray, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Hundreds of Islamic fighters from the war in Afghanistan are being interrogated here, held in small cells, with little or no exercise, and subjected to the full array of interrogation techniques.
Sensory deprivation is one of the favorites today. Putting somebody in a snow-white room, turning on the lights, turning up the air conditioning, serving his meals at different times, insulting him. We're going back to techniques that were really perfected in the CIA during the Vietnam years, and that is subtle dialogue, total knowledge of the adversary, and poking holes in his vanity.
Another technique is to undermine a prisoner's cultural beliefs.
If you know that as an Islamic fundamentalist he looks down on women, you bring in a woman and you not only expose him to interrogation by a woman, but she knows to go for his manhood, to go for his sense of self as it is embodied in his belief system. She said, "Oh, aren't you ridiculous? Aren't you ridiculous?" Or she can sympathize and say, "See, I'm not so bad after all." He's so busy trying to hold off the stereotype that he doesn't see the lioness coming at him.
Despite the techniques at their disposal, Western intelligence agencies are still finding it hard to make the members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban talk.
Al-Qaeda is exceptionally well prepared to resist interrogation. From the manuals seized in Afghanistan, they had thought through the processes of interrogation. This, of course, adds a difficult element in being able to decipher what is fact and what is fiction.
Even though the detainees at Guantanamo Bay are proving hard to break, key Al-Qaeda leaders who are captured get handled differently.
Most of the ones that have been caught by US and Western forces have been transferred to third-party countries where the intelligence services are able to overcome the linguistic barriers involved in interrogation. They are able to use more severe techniques in terms of not only using physical pressure, torture, but also their ability to tap into and break down the cultural barriers to more effectively extract information as quickly as possible, often under the guidance of CIA and other Western intelligence personnel.
If we're dealing with a tough prisoner, we say, look, we'll turn you over to the Israelis. We'll lose you to the Egyptians. And that's enough, in some cases, to turn the tables and to change an attitude. So what we're doing today, I think, is updating a lot of old techniques, but we have a lot of bad cops to play into the scenario now.
But there are charges that these strong-arm tactics are an abuse of human rights.
Since September 11th, the question has arisen in people's minds whether it's acceptable to torture people during interrogations. The fact that that question is being asked means that the system of human rights protections for people who are being interrogated is under enormous strain. And if that question gets answered in the affirmative, yes, we can torture people, then the system is completely broken down.
18 hours into their captivity, our volunteers have been questioned and re-questioned. The interrogators know a great deal about the volunteers' mission, but they still lack a key piece of information, the secret agent's name. Then, a breakthrough. One of the volunteers indicates he wants to make a deal.
When the prisoner starts negotiating with his interrogators, with his captors, it is probably a recognition of the fact that he is nearing the end of his ability to cope, and he's trying to spin it out for as long as possible. I would see it as a weakening of the defenses.
Ben Funk, number 14, has sought out the female interrogator who was nice to him earlier.
Now, who is this special agent that you have reason to believe that we're looking for?
I can't give all the information until I know that I'm going to have a deal. Yes, assuming you have the power to get the deal done.
Of course I have the power. I had the power to kick out that unprofessional fool that was in there earlier talking to you. Did I or did I not?
You did.
I did. And I have kept him away from you, haven't I?
Well, then perhaps you're interested in Danny Ryman.
Danny Ryman.
Danny Ryman, the name of the secret agent the interrogators are looking for, the most important detail of all. The chief interrogator arrives to finalize the deal.
Okay, we'll verify these facts. In return, a deal's a deal. Okay? My partner says that we're going to give you something comfortable and get you in a comfortable position. Maybe you like to have some tea, coffee, something of that nature.
Sure.
All right. Okay, you're all set. Okay, be back.
The reward for cooperating, a dry overall and some food.
I was at physical and wit's end. It was no longer a game, it was real. I couldn't stop shaking. I was so cold, I was exhausted, and I needed some sort of relief.
Knowing nearly everything about the volunteers' secret mission and seeing how exhausted they are, the specialists decide to bring the exercise to a close a few hours early. They were able to extract 7 out of the 8 pieces of information the volunteers were hiding. Only the flight details have been missed.
Everybody's mission, the ultimate mission, was to set up a safe corridor to get an agent out. I think that it's quite clear that had we continued much longer, it was only a small amount of time before we would get every single detail. Many of you took different approaches. Some of you made up stories. Some of you refused to talk, period. Everybody had their own thing going. But in the end, everybody gave us just a little bit of the pieces that we could put together for the grand mission and get the whole scheme of things. That being said, all of you should turn around and see the faces of those you've been experiencing.
The interrogators have been impressed by the volunteers' stamina, and the interrogation has made a lasting impression on all of the volunteers.
When I went into this thing, I was unbelievably cocky. I thought it was going to be an absolute piece of cake, and I have been proven wrong.
This was the information that you got to the real thing.
We were pretty close. I think we missed a couple of pieces of information.
I think I totally blew it because I was too trusting. Right now I'm feeling pretty stupid for getting tricked into talking to this staff member.
You were good, I have to say. You were good. It's really interesting. Like, I'm curious what the aftermath is going to be. Just watching the news, whether I'm going to sort of empathize more if I see, you know, a POW or someone who's just been detained, and especially post-September 11th. I mean, obviously this is such an important, relevant issue today.
The impressions that I take from this, believe it or not, are great respect for people in captivity. We really have no idea what you feel when you're in total control of people that can do anything in the world they want to.
As we have seen, in times of extreme political crisis, governments and armies of all political persuasion have been prepared to use brutal methods in the quest for information. But is the information we get that way really worth the price?
The strong-arm tactics can elicit a certain kind of information. It can get a subject to tell you where a troop is located, who his best friend is, but it cannot elicit the kind of continuing dialogue that will yield strategic intelligence, which is what, after all, you really need in a war zone.
Faced with a new set of challenges in the 21st century, the debate continues about how far interrogators should be allowed to go, while the search continues for the most effective ways of getting people to talk who don't want to.